How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 70 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 70 is Givaldig. We're going to learn two Mishnayos. The first Mishnah is pretty interesting. It talks about understanding the holiness of the firstborn, the Kedushas Bechor. Of course, the firstborn male of a animal, of a cow, sheep, goat, would be brought as a korban, right? Basically, the firstborn male, if it's the Petarechem, which we discussed the other day, I don't remember if it was yesterday or the day before, with regard to humans, to people. We're going to learn all about Masechta Bechoros, that there's different types of Bechoros. There's pigeon Peter Chomer. There is Bechor Behema. There's Bechor Adam. Anyways, so the firstborn male animal of a goat, sheep, cow is given to the kohen, and the kohen then offers it as a korban. From the time that the bechor, that this firstborn male is born, it is holy. It has kedushas bechor. It's born already designated as a korban. Anyways, we are going to learn about that kedushas bechor. While it's a fetus, when it's born, while it's being born, we're going to see an interesting machlekes between Rav Huna and Rabbah. Anyways, so that's the first Mishnah and the first really Amud of Daf Ayin of Masechta Chullin. And Daf Ayin Amud Beis is a new Mishnah when the fetus of an animal dies, right? So up until now we've been discussing when you slaughter an animal and inside the animal there is a fetus. So the mother was shechted, and the shaila is, what's the status of the fetus? Here we're talking about where the mother's alive, but the fetus dies. And then the shepherd is going to extract the fetus from the mother. Is that fetus considered nevela or not? So very exciting daf today, and I hope that you will enjoy it along with me. We'll enjoy it together. So come, join me. Let's have a great time studying Daf Ayin, Daf 70 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Samach Tes, Amid Beis at the Mishnah. I'd say about 2/3 of the way into the Amud. How does that sound? It's an inside joke. You're gonna see soon enough why I chose to say 2/3. Now this is exciting. Says the Mishnah, Hamivakeres Mikasha Leiled. Okay, so as I mentioned in the introduction, today, the first Mishnah, we're going to be talking about Kedushas Bechor. We're going to be talking about firstborn animals. So if you have a ewe, let's say, a female sheep, and this ewe is struggling to give birth, and it's her first baby, and it's a male baby, so when it's born, it's going to have Kedushas Bechor. Now, the fetus, right, a firstborn male fetus does not have Kedushas Bechor. When it's born, it has Kedushas Bechor. So here we have this ewe who is struggling to give birth to her first child, which is a male. Now, so you have this ewe who is giving birth to her firstborn male, and she's struggling. So as this fetus sticks out its right arm, we could chop it off and feed it to the dogs. Sticks out its left arm, chop it off, feed it to the dogs. Yatsa rubo, but if the fetus went out, what's the word I should say here? When the fetus went out a majority of the way, so then already you can't start cutting off its limbs. Yatsa rubo, once it's a majority of the way born, Hareze you cover, then you have to any limbs, if you cut them off, you can't feed them to the dogs because they have kedushas bechor. Once once this baby is a majority of the way born, it's considered born, at which point, if the baby's born, so then it has kedushas bechor. It's a korban bechor. We're going to give this animal to the kohen, and the kohen is going to offer it as a korban bechor, so it's kadosh. So then you will be unable at that point, if you cut off its limbs and stuff, you'd be unable to feed it to the dogs. V'nifteres min abechora, so you'd have to bury it. V'nifteres min abechora, and now by this ewe giving birth to this male sheep, so that's her bechor. So any subsequent babies will not be bechors. Okay, Givaldi. Says the Gemara, Itmar was stated, Yotza Shlish, this is why I was talking about 2/3 of the way into the Amud. It is about 2/3 of the way into the Amud, but we're going to be talking about thirds and 2/3. Itmar was stated, Yotza Shlish, if the baby came out a third of the way, that's not, right, that's less than half of the way, so it's not yet considered born. But it's already on its way, a third of the way out. And when the baby had left its mother only a third of the way, so less than halfway, was not yet considered born, the owner sold the fetus to an Oved Kechavim. Now, if the owner sells the fetus to an Oved Kechavim, so then it doesn't have Kedushas Bechor. If it belongs to a Yid, so that's Kedushas Bechor, it gives it to the Kohen. But let's say the owner sold the fetus before the mother was giving birth to it. Let's say a week earlier. The owner had made a deal with a local non-Jewish person that the non-Jewish person owns the fetus of this animal. So when this fetus is now born, it will not have Kedushas Bechor. It's owned by somebody else. It's owned by this non-Jewish person, and therefore there's no mitzvah of Bechor for a fetus owned by a non-Jewish person. But what's unique about this scenario is that it wasn't sold, or how about this? As at the time that it was sold, it was already a third of the way born. So it wasn't yet halfway born. If it was halfway born, so it would be considered fully born. But it was a third. It was a third of the way born. And at that point, it was sold to a non-Jew. So that in and of itself could be okay. However, v'yotza shlish acher. But now it was born another third, which is 2/3 of the way out. Just like our Mishnah began 2/3 of the way into the Amud. Anyways, so this baby is now 2/3 of the way out, which means that it's fully born at this point. So now what happens? On the one hand, it was already sold to this non-Jewish person. On the other hand, as we're going to see, Rav Huna Amar says, Rav Huna, Kadosh, this baby sheep is a Bechor. It has Kedushas Bechor. And it has to be given to the Kohen. Rabba Amar Eino Kadosh. Rabba, however, disagrees and says, no, it's not Kadosh. It was already sold. Before, right, when it was only a third of the way out, it was not yet considered born. The owner sold it to a non-Jewish person. It's owned by a non-Jewish person. The baby is not Kadosh. It's not a Bechor. Rav Huna Amar Kadosh, the reason why Rav Huna says that it's Kadosh with Kedushas Bechor is because Kasavar Limafreya Kadosh, because Rav Huna says that once this baby is born, it's considered like it's retroactively Kadosh. That means that once the baby is a majority of the way out from the mother, it is considered Kadosh from the very beginning, from right when it began leaving the mother. Already from the beginning of its being born, it was already Kadosh from that point. Which means, if that's the case, once the baby is born a majority of the way, so we see that retroactively from the beginning of the birth, it it was kadosh with kedushas bechor the entire time. Umay dezavin lo klum zavin. Whatever deal he made with this non-Jewish person while the baby was a third of the way born is irrelevant, because we consider it that even before then, retroactively, this baby was kadosh the whole time, in which case the owner is unable to sell it to the non-Jewish person. Rabba Omer says, Rabba, Eino kadosh, that this baby is not kadosh and the sale is valid, because kasav mikanu lahaba kadosh. Because Rabba holds that when a baby is born and it leaves the mother a majority of the way, at that point we say, this baby is born, but up until then, whatever happened, happened. Masha haya, haya. Therefore, according to Rabbah, once it hits more than halfway, so at that point it's considered born, and at that point it would become kadosh with kedushas bechor. However, in this scenario, it had already been sold to a non-Jewish person, in which case there is no kedushas bechor in this case. My dezavin shapir zavin, and whatever the non-Jewish person purchased is a valid purchase. So we see that according to Rav Huna, the kedushas bechor is retroactive to the beginning of the birth. And according to Rav Huna. According to Rabbah, it's from the time that it is a majority of the way out and moving forward, but not before then. But Azdu the Tamayu, and they are consistent with their reasoning. The Itmar, because it was stated in another scenario, Yotze Shlish Derech Dolphin. I don't know how this works. I meant to look it up in the article to see if they can make sense of it, but I didn't. So I don't really understand it, I guess. That if you have a baby, right, so this ewe is giving birth to this first child, and it's a male. So if the baby went out of the body of the ewe, C-section, a third of the way C-section, and then 2/3 of the way v'shnei shlishe derech rechem, and 2/3 naturally. I don't really get how that would work. I feel like if you start doing a C-section, you just take it. How would a third of the animal come out C-section and 2/3 come out naturally? I don't know, but that's what happened in this case. Anyways, okay. So Rav Huna Amar Eino Kadosh. So Rav Huna says, look, this animal is not kadosh with kedushas bechor. Because Rabba Amar Kadosh. Rabba says it is kadosh with kedushas bechor. Rav Huna Amar Eino Kadosh. The reason why Rav Huna says Eino Kadosh is because Rav Huna the timing Darmin Limafreya Kadosh. Because Rav Huna says that it is Limafreya, meaning I didn't say some important stuff. I mentioned it the other day, but the bechor, of course, has to be peter rechem, has to be the first out of the womb of this ewe in our example. That would be a vaginal birth, a natural birth. A C-section birth is not peter rechem, and therefore, if you have a firstborn male but it's born by a C-section, it would not have kedushas bechor. Now, in this case, it was initially the first third of the way out was C-section, but the next 2/3 of the way out was a natural birth. So a majority of the birth was natural. However, according to Rav Huna, he says that we have to look limafreya. We have to look from the beginning of the birth. And we say, at what point was this animal considered born? Once it was more than 50% of the way out. Now, in terms of that first 50+%, most of that was a C-section, right? Of the first 50+% of the way of this baby's journey out, more than, right? Well, it's a little bit I think everyone probably understands it. It's just difficult to explain technically. But of like 100% of the, if we look at 100% of this baby's journey of the way out of its mother, and we look at, so the first 33% of that journey was C-section. So 33 out of 50 is a majority of the first 50%. Anyways, so this baby is considered born once it's more than 50% of the way out, yet a majority of that distance was C-section. And therefore, when we look at the majority, the initial majority, which is what makes it born, it was really considered C-section, and therefore it does not have Kedushas Bechor. Right, so Rav Huna Amar Eno Kadosh, Rav Huna Talmud Amar Lemafreya Kadosh, because he says that it's retroactive, Viruba Kama, and if we're looking at the initial rove, the first 50%, Leisei Berechem, we don't have that initial 50% naturally. The second 50%, the second 2/3 was natural, but the first 50% was not natural. Most of it was C-section. Rabba says, Kadosh, that it does have Kedushas Bechor, because Rabba the time of the Amr Mikan Ulahaba Kadosh. That from this point on, it is Kadosh, and says Rashi, Mikan Ulahaba Misha Yivaled Rubo. Now, I believe that Yivaled, to be born, implies natural birth. So when we say Mikan Ulahaba Misha Yivaled Rubo, once there is a natural majority, right, once the animal has been born naturally for a majority of its birth, whether this, in our case, 2/3 naturally was the first 2/3 or the last 2/3, it doesn't matter. But once you have a majority of the way naturally, so from that point on, it is Kadosh. And the fact that earlier there was a third that was C-section is irrelevant, because once you have in our case, the 2/3 that were natural, it's a Bechor. From that point on, the fact that there was initially C-section is irrelevant. And most of the birth of this animal was natural. So what do we see? So we have two examples. The first example where the baby was born, was sold after being born a third of the way. And the second example, where the first third of the birth was C-section, we see that in both scenarios, Rav Huna says that we have to consider the birth of this animal from the beginning, retroactively, whereas Rabbah says we consider it to be kadosh from the point that it is born and onwards, but not retroactively. Now, we need both cases. If we only had the first case, the case of selling the bechor, selling this baby to a non-Jew after a third of the way out, okay, I would say in that case, Rav Huna says retroactive, to say that it's kadosh from the time that it was born, and that the owner had no right selling this bechor to a non-Jewish person. Because to say like Rabbah, that it's mikanu lahaba, and to say that the sale was valid would be a leniency, because you're saying that this animal is not a bechor, and it belongs to this non-Jewish person. It's not going to be brought as a korban. So I might say that Dafka in that case, Rav Huna is stringent to say that no, it has to be retroactive, and it was kadosh the whole time, the owner had no right to sell it. But I might think that by the C-section case, Rabbah is being more stringent. He's saying that a majority of the birth was natural, and therefore this is a bechor. So maybe Rav Huna would agree with Rabbah in that case. So therefore I also needed the case of the C-section to show that Rav Huna still says goes with retroactive, even if that means that the animal will not be a bechor, because from the beginning, initially there was a C-section. And if we only had the case of the C-section, this is where Rabbah says that mikanu lahaba, because that's going to be stringent to say that this is a bechor. But maybe in the first case, by selling the animal to a non-Jew after a third of the way out, maybe you would agree with Rav Huna that we have to say that it's retroactive and be more stringent and say that this is a bechor, you can't sell it. Tzricha, therefore, we needed both cases in order to show that Rav Huna and Rabbah maintain their respective perspectives in both scenarios consistently. That Rav Huna goes retroactive and Rabbah goes from the point of the birth onwards. I'm going to take a shluck of tea and we'll go weiter. Okay, now, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah. We're going to ask a kasha on Rav Huna. We learned in our Mishnah, mikasha leiled, that if you have, Tanan, ha-mivakeres, ha-mikasha leiled, if you have this who's giving birth to her firstborn baby and she's struggling, mechatech aver, and you have somebody, as the fetus is poking out its arm, you have somebody there cutting off the arm, umashlich leklavim, and he's throwing it to the dogs. My love, mechatech maniach. So let's assume that it's talking about as the fetus sticks out its arm, you have somebody chopping off its right arm, leaving it on the floor, chopping off the left arm, adding it to the pile, right leg, left leg, adding it to the pile. So now you have a pile of limbs, and we're saying that then you can take these limbs and feed them to the dogs. Right, so my love, that you're cutting off these limbs as they come out, putting them in a pile, and then you're feeding them to the dogs. Now, v'i omar limafreya hu kadosh. Now, if you're going to tell me, like Rav Huna, that once a majority of this animal has come out, then it's kadosh milichatchila lemafreya retroactively. Well, then you cover me, ba'ilei. What if as the limbs are coming out, they're being chopped off and added to a pile, and then now a majority of the animal has come out, and the Mishnah is saying you could chuck all of these limbs to the dogs. Why can you chuck the limbs to the dogs? According to Rav Huna, they would be kadosh from the beginning. So all of these limbs in the pile should be kadosh. So no. What's happening in our Mishnah is that as the fetus sticks out its arm, it's being chopped off and thrown to the dogs. Its other arm chopped off and thrown to the dogs, etc. So even once a majority of that animal has been chopped off, everything has already been fed to the dogs, so there's nothing really to kind of preserve. Okay, now Frank the Gemara. So you're telling me, so you're telling me that in the event that as the fetus was sticking out a limb, it was being chopped off and added to a pile of animal parts. So you're telling me that once a majority of the animal is out and is born, it has Kedushas Bechor retroactively, and this pile needs to be buried? Adatana Seifa, but one second, what's the Seifa of the Mishnah? What does the Mishnah say after this? After the feeding to the dogs? Yatsa Rubo, that if a majority of the body of the baby came out at once, instead of just like one limb at a time, so Yikaver, well then, if you're going to cut up the limbs, you can't feed them to the dogs, you have to bury them. So we kind of like made a little bit of a leap there. What's the leap? Well, if you're telling me that the Reish is talking about you have this baby, this fetus that's being born, and it sticks out its arm, it's being chopped off and thrown to the dogs. Its other arm chopped off and thrown to the dogs. And then it skips, that's the Reisha. And then the Seifa is, and if the animal goes out, right, goes out from its mother a majority of the way at once, so then you have to bury it. But you're skipping a middle scenario. What's the middle scenario? That the animal was poking out its limbs one by one, and the limbs were being chopped off and added to a pile. In that case also, we said that once a majority of the animal is out and it's considered born, so that pile would have to be buried as well. So why jump from the scenario where the limbs are going out of the mother, being chopped off and immediately thrown to the dogs? Why jump from there directly to the animal just exiting the mother a majority of the way? Why not tell me about the scenario where the limbs are being chopped off and added to a pile, and then once the majority of the animal is out, the pile needs to be buried. It can no longer be fed to the dogs because it has kedushas b'chor milamafreya. So the Tana Seifa, instead of telling me in the Seifa, Yotza Rubo, Yikaver, that if the fetus leaves the mother a majority of the way in one go, and then you chopped off the limbs, so then they would have to be buried. They can no longer be fed to the dogs. The niftaram in a bechora, and the mother that this is already her bechor. The next baby she has won't be a bechor. Liflog v'lesne bedida, but in the ratio when we're talking about limb by limb, we should say, wait, when can you feed them to the dogs? That when, as you cut off each limb, you're immediately throwing it to the dogs. But if you're cutting off the limbs and putting them in a pile, yikaver, they would have to be buried. And I think the point is, I would say then certainly when a majority of the body comes out at once, they would have to be buried and you would be unable to feed them to the dogs. So why not tell me about that other case when you cut off the limbs one by one and add them to a pile, and tell me that once it's a majority of the way out, you would have to bury that pile. Hachinami kamer ein hachinami. This is how, I'll tell you how to understand the Mishnah. This, Taka, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. This is how to read the Mishnah. When do we say you can feed them to the dogs? If as you're cutting off each limb, you're throwing it to the dogs. But if you cut off the limbs and add it to a pile, well then that's no different. We treat it in the same way as we would treat the scenario where the animal was born a majority of the way, the cover, and the loch is that it would have to be buried in that case. When, as each limb comes out, it's being cut off and added to a pile, we would treat it the same way as if the animal just came out in one go a majority of the way, that any limbs that are cut off would have to be buried. Okay, amazing. So we saw a machlokes there between Ravuna and Rabbah about once a bechor is born, is that kedusha retroactive, like Ravuna says, or is it from the time that it's born and onwards, like Rabbah says? We tried to ask a question against Ravuna from our Mishnah, but that didn't really turn into much. Fregdi Gemara by Rave asks a question: Holchu be'evarin achar arov. When it comes to limbs, do they go after the majority, or lo holchu be'evarin after achar arov? Or maybe by the limbs, they don't go by the majority. Who wants to tell us what in the world this is talking about? Majority, the limbs? Hey Chidami, what's going on here? If what Rav is asking about is Kigon, for example, I wanted to look up where this comes from. Right. Because the Mesoras Hashash just says Kresos Daf Yud Dalet. Obviously, we didn't learn that yet. But it says Ayin Sham. Check over there. I feel like we've seen this before. I just don't remember where. Anyways, so this is kind of I feel like we've had several scenarios recently that aren't necessarily so hard, but they're a little hard to explain. Like even that, like the first 33% of the first 50%, like we had before, because it's not really 33% of 50%. It's really, 60% of 50%, but it's the first 33% of the first 50%. You see, gets weird to explain, but it's not a hard concept. This also isn't like that difficult of a concept, but it's like awkward to explain. So, hey, what's going on here? Ilema kigon sheyatsa rov b'miut aver. So if we're, okay, maybe this is what Rava's question is. Rava's question is, what if you have this animal, I guess let's say a bechor, is being born, and a majority of the baby has already been born. So of course we would consider that to be born already, right? Well, not necessarily. Why not necessarily? Well, that's the question. Why is that the question? Because, yes, a majority of this baby has been born, but contributing to that majority is, let's say, one of the legs. Now, that leg has only gone out of the mother a minority of the way, meaning a majority of the leg is still inside the mother. Choose, maybe I'll say an arm. I think I didn't look. I didn't look at any sheep birth videos. Yeah. I probably will eventually. Not super excited about that one. So we'll see. Maybe I'll get to it eventually. I think sheep births are, maybe the legs come first. Let's just say that. So I don't know. Who cares about what actually happens? It doesn't matter. This doesn't have to be an actual example. It just needs to be a theoretical example. I think that's fine. So many of these situations are pretty theoretical. We're going to see a bunch of weird stuff coming up after this. Akoponim, fine. So we can use the leg. That's fine. No, I want to use the arm. We're going to use the arm. Fine. So you have this bechor. It's mostly born. Most of his body is out. So it would be considered to be born, right? Kind of. You see, contributing to that majority is its arm. You see, part of the arm has already gone out of the mother. But a majority of that arm is still inside the mother. So now here's the question. On the one hand, if we look at the body of the baby as a whole, most of the body has already gone out of the mother. But contributing to that majority is this arm. Most of the arm, as we said, is still inside the mother. And if we go based on the rove of the Avarim, as we're asking about, if we go based on the rove of this particular arm, well, the majority of this arm is in the mother. And if we consider this arm, therefore, to be entirely in the mother, because the majority of the arm is still in the mother, well, then we lose the majority of the body being outside of the mother, right? Because while, yes, we have a majority of the body outside of the mother, we need the arm to be contributing to that majority. And if we say, well, a majority of the arm is inside the mother, and therefore we have to consider like the entire arm is inside the mother and cannot be contributing towards the majority that's outside of the mother, well, then we lose our majority. So the question is, what do we do in this case? We could say that what Rav is asking is, Haimiut de baroi, this minority of the arm that is outside of the mother and contributing to the majority that's outside of the mother, the majority of the body that's outside of the mother. So regarding this arm, do we say basar rov de aver shadin anle, that sorry, even though part of this arm is outside of the mother, we have to kind of consider it with the majority of the rest, right? With the rest of the arm, which is its majority, which is inside of the mother, and therefore we have to consider like it's inside of the mother, in which case we lose the majority of the body that's outside of the mother. Oh, basar ruba de uber shadin anle, or do we say no? It's going to contribute to the majority of the baby that's already outside, and it would be considered a majority outside. So pshita. So the Gemara says, well, that is obvious. De lo shavkinan ruba de uber vazina basar rov aber. We're not going to favor the majority of this one particular limb over the majority of the entire body, and therefore we are going to have this minority of the arm that has left the mother contribute to the majority of the fetus, that of this baby that has already been born. So rather this is what Rav is asking about. Kigon sheyotza chetzio birov aver. Rather, what it's talking about is that 50% of the baby has already been born. 50%. That's not a majority. It's 50%. However, contributing to that 50% is a majority of the arm. So can we say that, well, a majority of the arm has already left the mother? Let's add that minority of the arm that's still inside the mother and consider it like it's already outside of the mother. And now, that being the case, we can consider it like a majority of the baby has already left the mother. So again, for example, that 50% of the baby has already left the mother. The rove aver, but contributing to that 50% is the majority of an arm. The Kamibayle and Rav is asking, Hahu miut dibigavoy, regarding that minority of the arm that's still inside the mother. Ma'u l'mishdaye basar rov aver, can you consider it to be with the majority of the arm that's already outside of the mother? And if you add that minority that's inside the mother to the majority that's outside of the mother, it will contribute to having more than 50% of the body of the animal outside of the mother. I had a feeling that this stuff was going to be tricky. So, yeah, I guess there's a lot to explain on this daf. All right, I mean, it's a great one, but yeah, it's right. I guess this is daf you got to work through, huh? So what do we say? So that being Rava's question, what's the answer? Right, when you have 50% of the baby that's already been born, and we could theoretically, crunch some numbers to consider it to be more than 50%. So Tashma, well, let's learn from our Mishnah. Yotza Rubo, that if our Mishnah says, if a majority of the baby has already been born, Harezeh you cover, so any limbs that are cut off would have to be buried. They can't be thrown to the dogs. So my Rubo, when we talk about a majority of the baby being born, what are we talking about? Ilem Rubo Mamish, if it means literally a majority. Ad hashta lo ashma'inon dirubo kikula, what, do we not already know that a majority is like the whole thing? Obvious, of course, we already know. Yeah, if the baby has already been born more than 50% of the way, so it's considered born, and it has kedushas bechor, and of course you can't feed its body parts to the dogs. So clearly that can't be what the Mishnah needs to tell us. So Elad, rather, what must the Mishnah be talking about? Kigon shiyotza chetzio birov aver. Let's say that the Mishnah is talking about where only 50% of the baby had left the mother, but including that 50% was a majority of a limb, and we're saying that it's considered a majority because we're taking the part of that limb that's still inside the mother and adding it to the 50% that's of the body that's outside to say that it's more than 50%. So let's say that that's an answer to Rava's question. Lo, no, that's not what our Mishnah is talking about. Kigon sheyatza rubo b'miut aver. It's talking about where, like we described earlier, the majority of the baby has already left the mother, but that majority depends upon an arm that only a minority of the arm has left. The majority is still inside the mother, and de lo shavkinan rubo de uber de behema vazlinan basar aver, and we're saying that you would not ignore the majority of the body that's already left in favor of the majority of the limb that's still inside of the mother, and rather, no, we would consider it like the majority of the body has left the mother. Okay, so what do we do? So Rav had asked a question. Essentially, we said that what Rav's question is about if an animal has left the mother 50% of the way, but including that 50% was the majority of an arm and the minority is still in the mother, can we add it to say that more than 50% of the animal is left? We tried to bring a raya from our Mishnah, but that didn't work out. So Rav's question at this point remains unresolved. All right, now basically for the rest of the Amud, there's like some kind of, basically you could just stamp like a big teku on the rest of the Gemara, basically. But Rava asks, Karcho besiv mao, what if you wrap the fetus in palm bast? Basically, the in order for this baby to be a bechor and have kedushas bechor, it would have to be peter rechem. It would have to go out through the mother's womb. But what if you wrapped it in palm bast, and then once it was wrapped in palm bast, you pulled it out of the womb, I guess, and I guess at least the head or whatever was not touching the womb. Betalisomau, or in a garment. Bishul yasomau. What if you wrap it in its placenta? Bishul yasu orchi. What do you mean? It's already in its placenta. El bishul acheres. What if you wrap it in a different placenta? Mau. Karachto ve'achazto ve'otziaso mau. What if the person who's helping the sheep give birth kind of stuck his hands into the inside of the sheep and then kind of grasped the baby and was kind of pulling it out such that the baby was not actually making contact with the womb as it was being pulled out with the birth canal? Mao echidam, what are we talking about? Idenafik derech reishe. Well, if it was coming out head first, well then patarte, well then I guess that the head would have been poter rechem, I guess, when it initially came out. Eladinafak derech margilosav. Okay, it's coming out feet first. Okay, it's coming out feet first, and then you kind of wrapped, I guess, the head in stuff, and it didn't make contact with the rechem. So bilateu chulda. What if a weasel swallowed up the fetus, votziato, and then so? What does this even mean? I actually didn't look this up. This sounds, I didn't confirm in the article this is what it means, but does this mean that a weasel ate the fetus and then the weasel crept out of the womb? Ma, what's the halacha? Otzi aso afikte. What do you mean? What are you asking? The weasel took it out. So if the weasel, I guess, swallowed it up and took it out, so the weasel left the womb, not the baby. Ela blaato votziato. The weasel swallowed it up, took it out, vechnisaso, and then put it back in. Vakiaso vomited it out back inside the mother. Viatza me'elav, and now the animal came out on its own after it was eaten by a weasel, taken out, put back in, vomited up. Well, I did not look these up, but yeah, they're pretty kind of out there, right? Could that be possibly what it means? I mean, what else would it mean? I'm could be I'm majorly off here, but I might not be. So hidbik shnei rechamim ze v'yesh v'yatza mizeh v'nichnas hazeh. What if you made adjacent two wombs next to each other, and the baby left one womb and went directly into the other womb? Mau. Didei potter. Okay, so when it leaves its mother, so it's potter the rechem of the mother, but dilav didei lo potter, but it went from its mother into another womb. When this baby leaves the second womb, who's not its mother, maybe it's not potter that mother's rechem. Odoma dilav didei nami potter, or maybe it also is potter the rechem of the other animal. Teku, it's a tie. By Rav Acha asks, niftechu kosle beis harechem mau. What if the womb opened so wide that the baby just kind of fell out and didn't actually make contact with the womb? So avirechem makdish ve'aika is the main thing, that it was in the womb initially, and it was. Or maybe it needs to make contact with the womb as it's leaving the womb. That didn't happen in this case, where the womb opened so wide that it just kind of fell out. But Marbar of Ashi asks, Nekru kosle besarechem mau. What if the walls of the womb got torn out? Nekru alesna. What do you mean? What happens if they're gone? Then obviously, then there's no contact with them, and it's not a bechor. So ela nekru. No. What if they got torn out, but then they got torn into the uterus, and they got wrapped around the neck of the baby? My. Do we say, look, the contact with the womb is only relevant in the womb, not when it this walls kind of are ripped out and end up around the neck of the baby. Maybe it doesn't matter, even around the neck of the baby is fine. Even when it's wrapped around the neck, it could also be a Bechor. Bai minei Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Yirmiyah asked Rabbi Zera, Nigmamu kosle b'serechem. What if the walls of the womb get peeled away? Amar lay. So Rabbi Zera responds, Ka nagata be baya de ba'i de ibayislan. Well, that's similar to the question that we asked. The Bai Rabbi Zera v'amila ba'mine Rabbi Zera of Asi omeid muruba la paritz. Was hilchos eruvin? If in the womb the part of the walls of the womb that are unpeeled and still there are more than the parts that have already been peeled away. V'yatza derech parts, but on its way out, the animal passed through the part of the womb that was already peeled away. Parts mubal omid, or if the parts that are peeled away are the majority, it's more than the parts that are unpeeled. V'yatza derech omid, and the baby went out via the part that is unpeeled. My adkan lo ibaya lei ela parts mubal omid the ika omid ba'ola. Well, the thing is, they only asked about when most of the womb was peeled away, but at least there was still some part that was unpeeled. Avol nigmimu, but when they're completely peeled, lo komibayali, they didn't ask about. What's the lo komibayali? Okay, I imagine that the point is that in that case, certainly, if there was no womb at all, it would be considered not kadosh with kedushas bechor. So, go figure. And now we get up to the next Mishnah, Daf Ayin Amud Beis, to the next Mishnah, discussing when the fetus of an animal dies. Now, this is pretty interesting because, up until now, we've been talking about where the animal has been, the mother has been shechted, and now that the mother has been shechted, so the fetus, whether the fetus, they cut it open, the mother open, and they find that the fetus is alive, or whether when you shechted the mother, the fetus is also dead. We say in that case, not only is the fetus not nevela, it's tahor, but you can even eat the fetus. Now we're talking about a scenario where the mother is still alive. The mother is still alive, but they find that unfortunately the baby is not alive anymore. That's what we're talking about. So, behema shemes ubra b'soch me'el. So when you have an animal that its fetus died, the animal is still alive, but the fetus is dead. V'oshed haroes yado, and the shepherd who takes care of the animals stuck his hand into the mother, v'nagabo, and touched the fetus, the dead fetus. Regardless of if we're talking about like a donkey, that's a tummy animal, or a sheep, that's a tahor animal. Either way, the fetus is not nevela, and therefore the shepherd remains tahor. Again, an animal that its fetus died, as yado, and the shepherd sticks his hand into the mother who is alive, v'nagabo, and he touches the dead fetus, whether we're talking about a tamei animal like a donkey, whether we're talking about a tahor animal like a sheep, tahor, the shepherd is tahor, the fetus is not nevela. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer says, Rabbi Yossi Aglili b'tmeya tamei uv'tahor tahor. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says it depends on the animal. If we're talking about a donkey, a tamei animal, the shepherd will be tamei. If we're talking about a tahor animal, like a sheep, the shepherd will be tahor. My taima, ask the Gemara, my time is the Tanakama. How come the Tanakama says that regardless of if we're talking about a tahor animal or a tamei animal, regardless if we're talking about a donkey or a sheep, let's say, the shepherd is tahor, the fetus is not nevela. Rav Chizda says of Chizda kavachomer because it's a kavachomer, as I kind of like hinted to in explaining the Mishnah, which is im ho'ila imo latiro ba'achila lo seyu lo litahore midei nevela. If you remember yesterday, without getting into the complicated question of ilfa, we had discussed, and we're going to reference it, but we don't need to go into explaining the whole thing, but if there is a point I want to make from it, Ilfa had asked yesterday, if you slice through the trachea, and then the fetus pops out its arm, and then you slice through the esophagus. So the question is, would that be considered a valid shchita, at least vis-a-vis this leg that popped out, so that at least it shouldn't be nevela? And we had said there that, you see, when you started slicing through the trachea, there were two objectives in the shchita. That was not only should it not be nevela, but also you should be able to eat the animal. That was right. When you shecht an animal, you have two objectives. Not only that it shouldn't be nevela, but also that you should be able to eat it. Now, once this fetus popped out its arm after the trachea, we had said then, maybe, at least when you slice through the esophagus, maybe, sure, you won't be able to eat this leg anymore that popped out. But even though the shchita will not allow you to eat this leg that popped out, but at least, at the very least, maybe it should be able to prevent the leg from being nevela and being metame the rest of the animal. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this to make the point that there's like two levels almost of shchita. That there are these two objectives. The lower level one is, at least this animal shouldn't be nevela. At least this proper shchita will prevent this animal from just being a nevela. Otherwise, dead animals are nevela. They're an avatuma, they're metame. And the second thing that shchita accomplishes is that you can actually eat it. So now, what's Rav Chizda's kal v'chomer? Rav Chizda's kal v'chomer is, if when you slaughter an animal, you slaughter this mother, and the mother's now dead, slaughtered but dead, its fetus, dead or alive, regardless, not only is it not nevela, sorry for the double negatives, but not only is it not nevela, you can even eat it. So if when we're talking about the dead fetus of a shechted animal, the fetus being inside of the mother allows it to even be eaten, since it was inside the mother at the time of the shechita, not only is the fetus not nevela, it could even be eaten. So certainly this fetus that's also dead and is inside of a mother who's alive, at the very least, it shouldn't be nevela. Oh, that's Rav Chizda's kal v'chomer. Rav Chizda says, Rav Chizda, kal v'chomer im ho'ila imo le'atiro ba'achila. If when you slaughter the mother, the shchita of the mother allows the dead fetus not only to just not be nevela, but also even to eat it, lo so'i lo litahure midei nevela. Come on, it's got to be that this dead fetus inside a live mother, at the very least, is not nevela. Okay, that works for be'ema tahora, for a sheep, for example. The kal v'chomer works. If you slaughter the mother, you can even eat the fetus. What about a donkey? There's no slaughtering donkeys and eating fetuses of donkeys. So you don't have that kal v'chomer for a donkey. So on my kra, the pasuk says, V'chiyamus min abehema, that when the pasuk says V'chiyamus min, this is a pasuk by nevela. That V'chiyamus min abehema, when you have an animal that dies, zo behema tmeya. That's a reference to a behema tmeya. Asher hi lachem la'ochla, that is for you to eat, zo, of course, behema tahora. So iskash behema tmeya lebehema tahora. So we see that there's a juxtaposition between tamei animals and tahor animals in that pasuk. Ma behema tahora ubra tahor, and just like by a kosher animal, its fetus, even if you have it, like in our Mishnah, there's a dead fetus, it is tahor, it's not nevela, and the shepherd remains tahor if he touches the fetus. The same applies even to a donkey, a tamei animal, ubra tahor. If you have a donkey and its fetus dies, it will be tahor as well, because it's compared to a kosher animal. And just like by the kosher animal, it's tahor, so all because of the kal v'chomer of Rav Chizda, so also by a non-kosher animal. Rabbi Yossi Aglili, my taima. And what about Rabbi Yossi Aglili? So we just explained the Tanakama, why the Tanakama says that both by kosher animals and non-kosher animals, that the fetus dies, it is not nevela. What about according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who says that this concept is only by kosher animals? By kosher animals, if the fetus dies, it's not nevela. But by non-kosher animals, said Rabbi Yossi Haglili in the Mishnah, if the fetus dies, it is nevela. And if the shepherd touches it, he is tameh. So Rabbi Yitzchak, says Rabbi Yitzchak, because the pasuk says, I'm going to read you the pasuk. V'chol holech al kapav, that any animal that walks on its kapav, that walks on its hands, but kilo, essentially it's a reference to an animal that does not have split hooves. An animal that does not have split hooves, and it has basically an animal with split hooves kind of walks on 8 rather than on 4, right? So a donkey, for example, doesn't have split hooves. It has hooves, but they're not split. It's just one hoof. They're just one round hoof. So a donkey is considered to walk on 4 because it's got 4 hooves. A goat, sheep, cow, they have split hooves. So it's kilu, they walk on 8. So now, holech al kapav, so any animal that walks on its kapav, which is a reference to basically, what does Rashi say? Kapav, holech al kapav, she'ein parsosav stukot. It does not have split hooves. Bichol achaya, ha'oleches al arba, that is inside of a animal that walks on 4. Not on 8, but on 4. Tmeim aim lachem kol noger b'nivlasim yitmar ha'arev, it's nevela. So again, what does this pasuk say? Bichol ha'olech al kapav, bichol achaya ha'oleches al arba. I.e., when you have a holech al kapav, which we said doesn't have split hooves, so for example, a donkey. So essentially, a donkey fetus, a holich al kapav bichol achaya ha'oleches al arba. When you have a holich al kapav that is inside of an animal that is holich al arba, i.e., you have a donkey fetus that's inside of a donkey. Right? A donkey walks on 4 and doesn't have, right, as opposed to 8, and doesn't have split hooves. So it says Rabbi Yitzchak, the pasuk says, "B'chol holech al kapav, b'chol achaya ha'oleches v'chulei." You have a holich al kapav, which is, for example, I'm going to use donkey as our example for tummy animal. So you have a donkey, b'chol achaya, that's a fetus inside of its mother. Ma'alche kapayim b'chaya timesi lecha. So it says the Gemara that the Torah is saying that a mahalche kapayim, which I'm going to refer to as a walk on 4, an animal that walks on 4, as opposed to a goat, sheep, cow that walk on 8 because they have split hooves. An animal that walks on 4, that's inside of its mother, and then dies, timesi lecha, is tameh. If the fetus of a donkey dies, it's tameh. Ela me'ata kalut b'mei para litame. But in fact, the Gemara, if that's what we're saying, that it's just based on if the fetus is a holich al kapayim, well then I would say, what if you have a calf, and as we've talked about in the past few days, and this calf, its hooves are not split. So you have a fetus of a calf, and the fetus of this calf, its hooves are not split. So here's an example of an animal that's walking on 4, that's in its mother. Litame dimalchi kapayim b'chayu. So should we say that it is tameh just like a donkey is tameh because it's a mahalche kapayim, it doesn't have split hooves, that's inside of its mother. So mahalche kapayim b'malche arba. Well, the thing is, the pasuk says, again, if we look at the pasuk, v'choholech al kapav, b'chol achaya uleches al arba. We're talking about a holich al kapayim that's inside of a mother that is holich al arba. V'hai malche arba, but when you have an animal, a cow, whose hooves are not split, but it's inside of it, you have a calf whose hooves are not split, but it's inside of a cow, b'malche shmono. The cow with its split hooves walks on 8. So even if the fetus of the calf only has 4 hooves, it's inside of a mother that has 8, right, that walks on 8, and the pasuk talks about walking on 4, that the mother has to walk on 4, not 8. But for the Gemara, par b'mei gamel. Okay, but what about if you have a cow, a calf has 8. A calf walks on 8. A calf with split hooves walks on 8. But it's inside of a gamel. a camel is considered, I don't know how you have a cow and a camel, but you have a cow inside of a camel, and a camel is considered to walk on 4 because it doesn't have completely split hooves. So you have an animal that walks on 8 that's inside of an animal that walks on 4. Loti tameh, I should say that this cow that's inside of the camel should not be tameh, because again, the pasuk talks about an animal that walks on 4 that is a fetus inside of an animal that walks on 4. Here we have an animal that walks on 8, a calf, inside of a camel that walks on 4. So the malchi shmona b'malchi albu, because it's a walker on 8 instead of a walker on 4. We need a 4 in 4. Holech v'chol olech. Well, the pasuk could have just said holech al arba and al kappa, but it says v'chol holech al kappa to include even l'rabos par b'mei gamol, to include a cow that is inside of a camel that it would be tameh. Kalut b'mei kluta. What about if you have a calf whose hooves are not split, as a fetus inside of a cow whose also hooves were not split? It was born without split hooves, and its fetus also does not have split hooves. So both are walkers on 4. So litami, we should say that it's tameh because it matches the description of the pasuk. The malchi arbu, because both the fetus and the mother are mahalchi arba. And the pasuk had said that v'chol holech al kapav b'chol achaya oleches al arba should be tameh. Yeah, but don't forget Rav Chizda's kavachomer, that if you have a mother, that when shachting the mother, it would allow the fetus to be eaten. Certainly in this case, when the mother's alive and the fetus dies, it would not be available. And that kavachomer would apply here, because you'd be allowed to eat the mother and the fetus if they were shechted. Maskif Rav Achdevoy bar Ami. But Rav Achdevoy bar Ami asks the following question: Chazir b'mei chazirta. But what about a chazir? A chazir has split hooves. A chazir walks on 8. So if you have a pig inside of a pig mother, both walk on 8, just like a cow walks on 8 and a sheep walks on 8. So loli tame the malchi shmonu b'malchi shmonu. So I would think then that if the fetus of the pig dies, it should not be nevela, because they both walk on 8. So Elam Rav Nachman by Yitzchak me'acha. Rather, says Rav Nachman by Yitzchak, we learn it from the following pasuk. This is a pasuk by Tumas Mikdash v'Kodashiv. This is a pasuk that we learn about at the beginning of Masechta Shavuos by Korban Olav Yored. Nefesh kisiga b'chol tamei o benivlas chaya tmeya. The nevela of a chaya tmeya, or benivlas behema tmeya, or a behema tmeya, or benivlas sheretz tmeya, or a shemetz sheretz. Why are we not talking about the nevela of behema tahora also? Why are we talking about behema of a chaya tmeya, behema tmeya? What about behema tahora? If you have a nevela, a behema tahora could also be a nevela. Right? A sheep that drops dead is nevela. What? Only the nevela of behema tmeya is mitame, uvitora lo mitama, but the nevela of behema tahora is not mitame. Of course, it's mitame. Why is that not included in the pasuk? Ela eze zeh. So what are we talking? What would be a scenario then when the nevela of a behema tahora would not be mitame? Ze uber she b'tmeya tamei. Rather, what's going on? What the pasuk is saying is that in the scenario of fetuses that die inside their mothers that are alive, the mother's alive, the fetus dies. So by a behema tameya, it will be tameh, but by a behema tahora, it will be tahor. So we learn out from this pasuk by Korban Olav Yored that where we're only focusing on tummy animals, because we're talking about the fetus that dies, the tummy animal will be mitame, will be an avela, but not so the tahor, which is why the tahor is left out. Let me take a shluck of tea and we're going to wrap up over here. So now the Gemara asks, Ume'achar dinafkale midav Nachman by Yitzchak. to Rabbi Yitzchak Lamali. So the Gemara asks an interesting question. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is an Amora. Rabbi Yitzchak is a Tana. So, if ultimately we had a problem with Rabbi Yitzchak, we asked a question on Rabbi Yitzchak's. Right, Rabbi Yitzchak wanted to say the animal that walks on four that's inside an animal that walks on four. But we said, what about a pig? We had trouble with Rabbi Yitzchak. We ended up learning it from Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's pasuk. So then, what do we do with Rabbi Yitzchak? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, the Amora, came up with this pasuk. What about Rabbi Yitzchak's pasuk? So now that we're learning from Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak by Korban Olav Yored, that the fetus of a tamei animal is tamei, that the fetus of a Torah animal is tahor when it's dead, whatever. Where am I? Did I read this? Oh, my brain is starting to get fried. I think I read the same line over again. Why do I need Rabbi Yitzchak? So the Gemara answers the following, with this will end. Sorry for my fried brain, but you won't have to deal with it for much longer. Tomorrow, we're going to see that Rebbe learns a drasha from this pasuk that Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak brought, the pasuk by Korban Olav Yored, where it talks about behema tmeya and chaya tmeya. It doesn't say anything about Torah animals. And we say it's talking about the fetus that dies. And we're saying it's only tamei because we're talking about tamei animals, not Torah animals. That pasuk by Korban Olav Yored, we're going to see tomorrow that Rebbe makes a drasha on that pasuk. And comes with Nachman bar Yitzchak, the Amora, to say that it's talking about our case of the dead fetus. Now, I would have thought, wait a second, maybe we can't rely upon Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. He's an Amora. Rebbe Atana is learning something else out from that pasuk. Maybe we would say that pasuk is only for Rebbe's limud, not Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's limud. So comes Rabbi Yitzchak, the fact that Rabbi Yitzchak, who's a Tana, learns from that other pasuk, which ultimately we had trouble with based on the pig, but from the fact that he learns out this concept of the fetus of a behema tahora being tahor, while the fetus of behema tamei being tamei, based on the fact that Rabbi Yitzchak learns out the concept from that pasuk, we can use that as an indication that we can rely upon Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's pasuk, because ultimately Rebbe is learning it. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's pasuk mentioned behema tmeya, chaya tmeya. So Rebbe's limud is really from behema tmeya. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is from the chaya tmeya. So they're learning that from different parts of the pasuk. But maybe I would have thought that the pasuk is reserved entirely for Rebbe, who's a Tana, and Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak can't argue on that. But from the fact that Rabbi Yitzchak is making a drasha about the Torah fetus versus the Tamei fetus, allows us to say that yes, we can rely upon Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's drasha from the chaya tmeya in the pasuk by Korban Olav Yored. Wow. How long was this? Is a long daf, right? Hour and 20 minutes. Oh, yeah. Wow. Wow. Behema makasha leilit. What do you want me to tell you? We knew it was going to be trouble. We knew it was going to be a difficult parak. Wow. Just one, it's like zvachim and menachas. Wow. On daf 70 of Masechta Chullin, we essentially had two parts over here. The first part was about understanding the holiness of the firstborn. Very interesting. We saw machlokas there between Rav Huna and Rabbi. Rav Huna says that the holiness is retroactive to the beginning of the birth. Okay? So the animal is only considered born once it's more than 50% born, but once it's more than 50% born, it's considered kadosh from the beginning of the birth. Nafkaminas, if you tried selling it to somebody, right, to a non-Jew, a third of the way through. Rabbi says that it's kadosh from the time that a majority of the baby is born. Once the baby is born a majority of the way, it's kadosh from that point on. If you had already sold it before then, it's sold. And then we got into all sorts of other discussions along the way, confusing stuff, tricky stuff. Anyways, then we got to the second half of the daf, where we got to a new Mishnah, talking about when the fetus of an animal dies. The Chachamim said the fetus is tahor. Whether the animal is a tahor animal like a sheep or a tamei animal like a donkey, doesn't matter. The fetus is tahor. When the shepherd goes to take out the fetus, he remains tahor. The fetus is not nevela. Rabbi Yosef says it depends. The fetus of a kosher animal is tahor, but the fetus of a non-animal is tamei. Of a non-kosher animal is tamei. And then we looked at the Gemara to learn out the different sources for the opinions. Friends, that was Daf 70 of Masechta Chullin. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.